As anybody that knows even the tiniest little thing about Islamophobia, there are numerous definitions and understandings of Islamophobia out there. How we should conceptualize it, whether we should consider it as a form of racism, or whether it is a particular expression of Orientalism, whether it's a recurring hostility to an ever-present other. There are various theories about the origins of Islamophobia. Is it a product of a clash of civilizations, of worldviews that we can't bring together, one liberal, one Christian, one Eastern, one illiberal? Or should we locate its most recent manifestations in something more modern, the end of the Cold War and the shifting political and ideological allegiances that brought about? And of course, these differences are not just a question of semantics or academic navel-gazing, but the differences in the understanding of Islamophobia have a real bearing on how we respond to it and whether we consider it to be one particular type of issue or another. And what I would like to do in this session is not so much summarise the main theories, although I will attempt to do that. I will try to rehearse the main contributions to this area, but also to suggest that the many competing explanations of Islamophobia are not so much disputes about the nature of a single phenomenon, but that quite often these competing explanations are each referring to something very different. So that in effect, there is not one Islamophobia, but many Islamophobias. Perhaps the easiest way to begin to kind of delve into the kind of morass of explanations is to broadly divide the theories, the competing theories, into two separate camps. The first is those that focus on the question of the reality of Islamophobia, on whether Muslims really do experience a hostility and perhaps a discrimination that is targeted specifically at them as Muslims. And the second camp are those that are concerned more with trying to grasp Islamophobia at a conceptual level and possibly at a level that involves questions of social justice as well. In one respect, and looking at the audience, I know many of you, and I think it would be fair to say that most of you would probably question why bother talk about that first camp. You know, those people that dismiss Islamophobia as something that's not real. Surely they're just racists, surely they're Islamophobes themselves. But I do think it's worthwhile paying some attention to them. For a start, they seem slightly crazy, if you like, to be able to ignore what many of us would consider to be an undisputed reality. The Islamic Human Rights Commission recently published this report which gave a very depressing account of the increase in the number of mosques that have been attacked, of Muslims that suffer from verbal and physical abuse. We know that since the attacks in Paris, attacks in this country on Muslims has gone up by 300%. We know that the number of Muslims who are reporting verbal abuse has escalated, and we suspect that the number is much higher than those that are reported. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the stereotypes and the hostility and the negative language that is used about Islam and Muslims in the media. We also know that the nature of media coverage on Islam and Muslims is of a very particular type. So there was one report published by Liz Fecht which looked at newspaper coverage of Islam, and what she found was that not just that it was overwhelmingly negative, but that there was in 60% of articles where there was negative things written about Islam or the Muslim world, there was a picture of a woman wearing a veil, even where the woman wearing the veil had nothing whatsoever to do with whatever the actual focus of the article was. So there is this not just a negativity and a hostility, but a reinforcing of image and message and text. But what those who dispute that Islamophobia is an issue are doing is not disputing that there are individual acts of discrimination, abuse or violence. What they are disputing is that they do not constitute a discrete phenomena within society in the same way that homophobia or racism or anti-Semitism does. What defines those concepts of like homophobia or racism is that it takes place in response to the phenomenon or the group in question where it is thought to be illegitimate. The issue of Islamophobia is that writers like Sam Harris or Hersey Ali or Melanie Phillips, I've missed out some of my PowerPoints, argue that essentially there is no such thing as Islamophobia because the phrase denotes an irrational and illegitimate hatred of Muslims, and that actually the hostility towards Islam, as argued by these people, is neither illegitimate nor irrational, and therefore Islamophobia does not exist. I don't know whether any of you have seen this on YouTube. It's particularly entertaining. It's on an American chat show with Sam Harris, who's probably the leading kind of proponent of this particular idea. And he got in this huge argument with Ben Affleck, who I'd just seen Ben Affleck as Batman, I think. So it was quite entertaining to see him arguing the liberal corner as to why discrimination against Muslims was a form of racism. And Sam Harris was arguing what you're doing is you're closing the argument down. What you're doing is by saying that Muslims should have equal rights in the way that other people in America have equal rights. What you're actually saying is you're undermining liberal democracy. For Harris, the term then is a misnomer. Islamophobia is a misnomer, simply because hatred of Islam is not irrational or illegitimate. And although that sounds bizarre to most of the people sitting here, I wanted to start with this particular camp of theories for several important reasons. The first is that, unlike the other theories, it is hostile to Islam, clearly. Whereas the other definitions that I'm going to look at start from the premise that however much they disagree about the nature of Islamophobia, they believe that it denotes a form of injustice and therefore should be addressed. And though we may feel inclined to dismiss this form of of response to Islamophobia as ridiculous, it's particularly important because it identifies a very problematic feature of Islamophobia. And the problematic feature is that many people accuse Islamophobia itself as being an anti-illiberal mechanism. In the sense, what it does is it makes criticism of Islam illegitimate. So what was happening in this particular interview is Sam Harris was saying, what you're saying, by calling me an Islamophobe because I'm criticising Islam, you are not allowing me to voice criticism of Islam. You're essentially taking away my capacity for free speech. And therefore, the whole notion of Islamophobia as a concept has this kind of dual problematic nature with it. Not is there the question of how we define it, but there's a question of how we situate it in the wider canon of free speech and what some people call the possibilities of secular critique. This is a question that I want to return later because I do think it's something that we need to address, and particularly in education. I've just finished a 4-year study of students training to be teachers in the primary sector, overwhelmingly women, and what they nearly all said without exception was that they felt that they weren't able to discuss Islam critically with children in their classrooms because they were afraid of being called Islamophobic, but also because they themselves felt very uncomfortable in talking about many customs associated with Islam, especially to do with gender and to do with the family. And so you have a situation where teachers who ideally should be in a position where they are fostering skills of criticality, free speech, traditional liberal values, which I'm sure most people would adhere to in the context of education, are drawing away from those particular values because they are afraid of how to engage with Islam. So I want to look briefly at the main approaches to defining Islamophobia. These are the theories in the other camp, if you like. And basically I'm going to be looking at the definitions provided by the Runnymede Trust, theories that could be labelled Orientalist, the work of Fred Halliday, Chris Allen. So let's start with the Runnymede Trust. I'm sure people have heard of the Runnymede Trust. There is a dispute in the literature over who invented the term Islamophobia. It's been variously credited to Edward Said, where in an article in 1985 he criticised those that failed to recognise that the same sources that fuelled anti-Semitism also fuelled anti-Muslim hostility, and he used the frame Islamophobia. Tariq Madood also used the term when he wrote a review of the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, and he said that the Satanic Verses was deliberate and a mercenary act of Islamophobia. However, it was the Runnymede Trust, which is an anti-racist multicultural think tank, that is usually credited with popularising the term in the UK. In 1997, they published a report, Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All, that was originally prompted by work that they were doing on anti-Semitism in the UK. While they were working on the report on anti-Semitism, a Muslim member of their research team noted that many of the forms of discrimination and the types of prejudice that were experienced by Jews in this country were very similar to those that were experienced by Muslims. And it seemed common sense, and it seemed very common sense to them to conclude that just as there exists a racism that is specifically Jewish in character, there also exists a form of racism that is specifically anti-Muslim in character, Islamophobia. Their definition that of Islamophobia, and it's up there, of something that is fear, hatred or hostility towards Islamic culture, Islam and Muslims, is fleshed out in the report by a number of signifiers that accompany Islamophobia. So they identified markers like Islam is seen as not just different but also inferior, that Islam is seen as monolithic and lacking in diversity, that Muslim criticisms of Western values and practices are always dismissed out of hand, and that Muslims are always seen as manipulative and never as sincere. And what the phrase that they coined was that if we wanted to combat Islamophobia, we needed to have open categories of understanding Islam rather than of closed categories. The Runnymede definition has prompted numerous criticisms. It's too simplistic, it's too vague, it's too ahistorical. But whatever those criticisms, and I think that some of them are legitimate, it is the case that the term entered the public and political consciousness after the Runnymede Trust published their booklet, and that in the following years it is the Runnymede Trust definition that is usually cited in mainstream policy. And if you look at all the texts in education that deal with multiculturalism or anti-racism or that deal specifically with Islamophobia, it is always the Runnymede definition that is there. And so whatever we think of this definition, it's important to acknowledge it in some way because it kind of plays the pillar, if you like, of it acts as a pillar within so many different documents and policies. The second form of, or the second kind of category of explanations of Islamophobia, if you like, are what I call Islamophobia as response. Possibly the broadest understanding of Islamophobia is an offshoot of the Runnymede position. And these definitions tend to locate the emergence of Islamophobia in the growth of anti-pluralist and racist attitudes in the West. What most of these theories do is they create a narrative that says, as Western nations continue their adventures in the Middle East with ever more devastation and an ever-increasing lack of moral authority, whether we're talking about Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or the outcome of the Chilcot report, with each of these events, Islamophobia gains strength as a form of justification for Western imperial aggression abroad and an excuse for the absence of toleration at home. This then is a theory that posits Islamophobia as a post-imperial discourse. In essence, it is a contemporary form of the white man's burden. I don't know whether many of you are familiar with the white man's burden, whether you're old enough to have had that part of history when you were at school, this idea that countries like Britain justified their kind of imperial and colonial adventures all around the world because it was their moral duty to essentially rip off the rest of the globe. In essence, Islamophobia becomes the justification for why countries like this country and other Western nations can intervene with impunity in other countries, obviously in relationship to Muslim countries, because they feel that those, because of the nature of those societies, if you like, almost demands a Western intervention. Fred Halliday has developed a particular form of critique of Islamophobia, which I think is worth looking at particularly, in the sense that his work is distinguished from Islamophobia as response and also from the Runnymede definition. And he's critiqued Islamophobia from a number of different perspectives. He questions not that there is a systematic prejudice and discrimination against Muslims, or that such a thing as Islamophobia is true. And he points out, references to the media, characterizations of Muslims in films, from diverse as, kind of Sex and the City, Iron Man, and Aladdin. This is always my favourite example, so I always try to use it wherever possible. Have you all seen Aladdin, the Disney version? Firehead, you need to go and watch Aladdin tonight after this lecture. It is true that Aladdin gets whiter as the film progresses, which is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. The lyrics are like something from the 30s, from the music. They're quite astounding in the kind of their explicit racism. But all the way through, you have in images and stereotypes and a narrative which is manages to be anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and basically anti-everything that isn't kind of home counties and white. Some of the other films, like that he identifies, like American Sniper, present a kind of Islamophobic which is more aggressive and probably easier to detect. But because this is a children's film, and you will find this in the kind of Disney library of everybody under 10. It's kind of worth noting that kind of Islamophobic messages start very young. What he also notes, Fred Halliday also notes, is that it's an international phenomenon. Islamophobia isn't just kind of rooted in the UK and America. And he points to the 1997 elections in India, where the BJP ran for a re-election on 3 explicitly anti-Muslim issues. The point for Halliday is that the term Islamophobia misses the point, because he argues it implies that what is being attacked is Islam, that it is Islam as a religion that is the focal point of Islamophobia. Halliday insists that in the majority of occasions, it is not Islam that is being attacked, but the actions and the behaviours of Muslims and the traditions of certain cultures. So when he looks at the film Aladdin, he says it's a normal, a traditional example of Islamophobia. He says, but it's not Islam that's being attacked. There's no critique of the Quran. There's no denigration of Muhammad. What is being critiqued here is a particular caricature of a Middle Eastern culture, which could be Islam, but is not specifically Islam. He also points, as another example, to the vilification of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the leader of a country where there were Muslims, but he was not a Muslim leader. It was actually a secular government, a secular culture, a secular society. And he said the hostility that many people, often very vitriolic hostility that they felt towards Saddam Hussein, was because of his politics and who he was, not because of anything to do with Islam and not to do with anything to do with traditional Muslim practices. And what he says, there are no books coming out questioning the claims of Muhammad or the Quran. The attack now is against not Islam as a faith, but Muslims as a people, the latter growing together all, especially immigrants, who might be covered by the term. The enemy is not a faith or culture, but a people. Hence, the more accurate term is not Islamophobia, but anti-Muslimism, which is a very awkward phrase. But I think you can see what he's trying to get at there. The last theorist that I want to look at is Chris Allen. Chris Allen is an academic at Birmingham University, and I think he could rightly be considered as a one-man industry when it comes to producing literature and research on contemporary Islamophobia in the UK. Like Halliday, he is critical of the term Islamophobia. He considers the definitions by Runnymede to be sloppy and so vague as to be unusable. And he has done more than any other academic to try to really provide a very precise definition of what Islamophobia is in this country. He insists that if the term is to be useful, we need to understand what it is exactly about Islamophobia that has Islam at its kernel. What is it about Islam that means that there is such hostility against it? And in order to do this, he distinguishes between Islamophobia as process and Islamophobia as product. There are, he says, discriminatory events or products. These are situations or actions that are experienced by Muslims which may or may not be the result of their being Muslim. So what he means by that is that somebody may be attacked who is a Muslim, but they may be attacked because they are not white, or they may be attacked because they are not Christian. They may be attacked because they are wearing a religious signifier. They may be attacked because somebody thinks they are an immigrant, or because they're an illegal immigrant, or simply because they're foreign, or because they are thought to belong to a particular race or nationality, because they're thought to be Arabic, Bengali, or Pakistani. They may be attacked for any or all of those reasons, none of which has anything to do with Islam or because they are a Muslim. And Allen then defines Islamophobia as a process, and he says there are three parts to this process. That is the front cover. I think it's a very good front cover of his book on Islamophobia. But there are three parts to the process that he defines. The first is stereotypification. I think he made that word up, actually. I don't think it's actually a real word, but it does describe what he's trying to get at. And he says this is the process of constructing a hierarchy of differences, the development of an ideology that perpetuates meanings about Muslims and Islam, and that presents the other, essentially. That is, values and practices associated with Islam are understood as alien and essentially different from the values and norms of our society and culture. What comes afterwards is how this othering is then represented through a process of embodying meaning and knowledge about certain groups through the mainstream of society, through the media or through education or other popular discourses like Disney films. And this is where the narratives of inferiority, etc., are developed, maintained and perpetuated throughout society. And the last part of the process is semiology, the mechanisms by which these representations are correlated with visual identifiers. And a good example of that would be the thing that I talked about earlier, where you have pictures of women wearing veils next to articles that have nothing whatsoever to do with women or veiling, but they are to do with some hostility towards Islam. Allen's understanding of Islamophobia is one that seeks to locate and fix the precise ideological nature of Islamophobia at its most abstract level. So, how can we assess the worth and validity of all these different definitions and all these different interpretations of what Islamophobia is? Is it possible to distinguish between them in such a way that we can actually work out whether Islamophobia itself is a legitimate phrase, if we hark back to that original point raised by Sam Harris? And I think that it is possible to go back and look at these definitions, if you like, and begin to unravel some of them. And by unravelling them, we can see some of their weaknesses, and we can also see some of their familiarities. So if we start first with a kind of Orientalist assumptions, what I find very interesting about the Sam Harris argument is that it is a form of Orientalism, in the sense that it posits this eternal hatred and mismatch between the West and the East, and it's almost like a reverse Orientalism where it eternalizes and essentializes those particular relationships. And Halliday argues that whenever we're looking at Islamophobia, what we really need is a healthy dose of historicism, because the same factors that lie, say, behind the escapade on beaches in Nice this summer, where French police were standing over Muslim women while they disrobed enough to satisfy French Republican virtue. Halliday points out it's hardly likely that the same factors that caused this also caused the Crusades. He says we need to get a sense of historical and cultural specificity here to understand that what might look like similar things, i.e. hostility towards Muslims or a vitriolic hatred towards Islam, could actually be two entirely different phenomena. Perhaps it is the Runnymede definition that is easiest to critique, though, actually. Not least because it is the most critique. Everybody seems to hate Runnymede for some reason. As mentioned before, Chris Allen objects to it on the basis that it fails to offer us an explanation of what it is about Islam or Muslims that is deemed to cause a phobia. He describes the othering process very well, but he doesn't actually say what is it about a woman in a veil, or what is it about the idea of a particular kind of worship around a mosque that so offends a liberal Western sensibility. And for me, he just doesn't answer that question. He also argues, I think, that although he differentiates between the experience of Muslims and those associated with Islam, and talks about how it may be the case that somebody may be attacked or abused or victimised for a whole number of different ways, he doesn't actually explain to us how we can actually identify why people are being attacked, or how we can differentiate between those who are attacked because they are Muslim and those who are discriminated and attacked because they happen to have the appearance of a refugee or to be Asian. I think that in some way Halliday's criticism of Runnymede is probably the more persuasive. He notes that by contextualising Islamophobia as the result of prejudice and misinformation and stereotyping, we pave the way for a response to Islamophobia that focuses on education, intercultural initiatives and religious literacy. This, says Halliday, is an example of political and humanist good intentions getting in the way of good sociological analysis. And I think that this is a really important point, because in education, at least, I'm not so sure about other fields, there is an assumption that Islamophobia is the result of ignorance. And the reverse of that, if only we could show children more about Islam, really explain to them, then they wouldn't be so prejudiced and bigoted about Islam. But, Sam Harris and Huntington know everything, know a great deal about Islam, but they are still bigoted. They still, are Islamophobic. That knowledge itself, in and of itself, does not answer the question of how we would confront or explain Islamophobia. Halliday also points out that there are distinct historical, cultural and regional variations in Islamophobia which wouldn't be explained by the Runnymede or the Chris Allen definition. He points out that in some education systems, and he's just talking about in the UK, there are approaches to Islam which are Islamophobic, which are very narrow, which are very unaccommodating, which are very illiberal. But there are other approaches, and the example, he doesn't use this approach, but it was a very famous example of some schools in Luton, which some of you may know is a region where there are significant Muslim communities. and many of the secondary schools in Luton have done amazing work in adapting school uniforms so that they can accommodate all different interpretations of the idea of modesty. It might sound like a facetious example to just talk about a school uniform, but it's an indication, if you like, of the variation of approaches. It is illegitimate to say all education is Islamophobic or all media is. And so we find, if you like, coming full circle, because Islamophobes may be ignorant or well-versed in Islam. Discrimination and abuse where it happens may be because the perpetrators know the victim is Muslim or not. All the theories are true to some extent. The Runnymede definition is true to an extent. The Orientalist theories do identify a continuity of hostility towards Islam that has gone across different cultures and historical periods. Alan is correct. There is a difference between process and product. And in some cases, Halliday is right. The prejudice is aimed not just at Islam, but often at Muslims, although, of course, sometimes the opposite is also true. So in relation to the question I highlighted at the beginning about whether secular criticism of Islam is ever legitimate, I think the answer is, of course, but sometimes, only sometimes. And the dominant approaches to Islamophobia, unfortunately, do not help us distinguish which is which. And so now we've come full circle and going back on ourselves again, round and round. So I'd like to suggest, just in my concluding comments, that the only way really to be able to engage productively with Islamophobia in trying to find out what it actually constitutes is, if you like, to step outside of this circle and take an approach which is context-driven and which also recognises the dialectical nature of the forces at play here. And I just want to take one example to explain that. And I'm going to take the example of the Veil Wars. I don't know whether people are familiar with what was called the Veil Wars. Were mostly a French affair, but they also happened in England as well, where there were these ongoing arguments about female pupils in schools and about whether it was legitimate or not for them to wear veils. And what was very interesting about the Veil Wars was that the French and the British response to the Veil Wars were so different. I mean, they were amazingly different. The French response resulted in changes to the law, changes to the Constitution, and a vociferous and antagonistic public debate about the nature of republicanism that questioned the relationship between the state, religion and education. You had the situation that quickly escalated into the police actually escorting women off the street. There was a very famous example in front of Notre Dame, and of families, entire families having to move from one region to another. In the UK, the debate by comparison was muted, was quite mild, and very often resulted in compromise. The example that I talked to before of the schools in Luton that went out of their way to develop kind of modesty-friendly school uniforms was an example of that. And this is where I think it's important to understand, if you like, the dialectical nature here, because what happened in France was that the result of the Veil Wars is that where it was estimated that when it began there were less than 500 women wearing a niqab in France, at the end of that process there were over 10,000. Where there wasn't Islamophobia, there is now, and it takes a very particular form. In England, the response has been quite curious in the sense that the number of women wearing hijab has increased slightly. I don't know how they know these things. I don't know whether people count. But the number of women wearing hijab in this country has increased slightly. But more interestingly, the hijab has now become, in significant communities in the UK, quite fashionable, in the sense that I can remember going to university in Manchester in the 80s, and you never saw a veil that wasn't black. Now, veils are pink and spotty and frilly and have diamantes on them, and they're colour coordinated. And again, you might say this is a very frivolous thing, but I think it denotes a particular engagement with religiosity, and it denotes a particular engagement with difference. And of course, the implications for Islamophobia are that it's very possible that the different types of engagement with difference will lead to a different form of state and popular response to Islamophobia. I'm not wishing to suggest for a moment that in England we are free from prejudice and Islamophobia. We are not. But what is interesting is that the responses of the state to the threat perceived by Islam has been very different. So just to give another example that looks at the French and the British example, in France they have instituted the explicit teaching of French Republican values. Which was something that had kind of fallen by the wayside for a while, but they've brought it back with a passion. In England, they have responded in some ways with the call for teachers to promote or not to undermine fundamental British values. The difference between the French and the British approach is that the British approach is entirely unfunded and in a document that stays in a cupboard in the back of a school somewhere, whereas in France it has become a major part of the curriculum. And so just the final word on Islamophobia. If we are to be able to understand what it is, I think we are on a hiding to nothing if we think we can find common aspects of Islamophobia that we can identify in different countries or different regions and different examples. To really understand Islamophobia, unfortunately for us, because it means so much more hard work, it actually means paying attention to the historical, the cultural and the political specificity of each individual incident and of each individual product. Thank you.